So welcome everyone, I'm Paula Sellers. We're going to do safety first. We'll talk the logistics for the exits. We have 2 exits on either side of the room. So whichever exit you're closest to, unless you can't exit on this side, please use this exit and exit to the parking lot. Okay. Can you hear me okay now? All right. So everyone understands about the exits, okay? All right, if you've not done so already, can you please silence your phones? And the purpose of this meeting is to provide overview of and accept comments for K-31 and K-33. For the meeting format, Roger Petrie will provide an overview of K-31 and K-33. Public input for the preferred alternative presented in the proposal plan will be video recorded. Those wishing to provide input or make a comment during the public comment segment are asked to indicate on the sign-up sheet when you enter the odd. You will be called in the order in which you sign up and have 3 minutes to speak. If you're not finished with your comment at that time, you can complete it after everyone has an opportunity to speak. Please speak into the microphone and ensure that your comment is captured on the video recording. Please state and spell your name for the record. If you do not want to provide comments, comment cards will be available and they'll be in the back of the room or where you first walked in. You can email them or mail them afterwards. I will now introduce DOE Oak Ridge Office of Environmental Management, Roger Petrie, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, Heather Lutz, and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 4, Craig Von Trees, and Samantha Eckhart Foster. Roger?
All right. Appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I know this is a great way to spend an evening. We are here tonight to present the selected alternative that was presented in the proposed plan for what we call the K-31, K-33 area groundwater project. This is an area ETTP that we have worked with both EPA and TDEC to come up with a proposed solution for groundwater contamination that occurred in that area. Oh wait, excuse me 1 second. Let's try it. There we go. Real quickly tonight, what we'll do is we'll go over a background of the overall process for the proposed plan, the CERCLA cleanup, the DOE's cleanup strategy for the reservation and how we got to where we are now. Then we will then go over the scope of the proposed plan of what we plan on doing in this particular area. We'll discuss the different alternatives that were evaluated as part of this proposed plan. And then we will cover the evaluation of those alternatives, how we look at each one of those alternatives and how we evaluate where they rank and how we come to the decision to choose the alternative that we did. Then we'll discuss different options for public input that we just discussed. And then we'll have a period at the end of the meeting for anybody who wishes to provide comments, or if they have a question, they can record the question, and we will those questions will be answered in the responsiveness summary of the eventual record of decision that will go with this follow this proposed plan. So the background, the idea is to cover the preferred alternative for this area. The comments that we're soliciting are not just for the proposed plan, but are actually cover the entire process, the RIFS that was done, or focused feasibility study that was done for this project to evaluate the alternatives. All of this information is available through the DOE Information Center. You can either go there in person or you can go to the website and request those documents from them. And then last is the preferred alternative is what we called monitored natural attenuation. It's an EPA approved method that we'll go over later in the presentation, but that is the alternative that we have selected for this remedy. How did we get here? In 1991, the EPA, State of Tennessee, and the Department of Energy entered into what we call the Federal Facilities Agreement. It was a an agreement that covers the cleanup of the Oak Ridge Reservation, the cleanup of, you know, the Cold War legacy that was created here. Then during the 1990s, the first thing we evaluated and addressed was what we called our off-site risk, Lower Watts Bar Reservoir. There was contamination that had entered there from the reservation. That was addressed. And then many of you may remember when we did what was called the Lower East Fork Poplar Creek remediation in through the middle of town. Areas along the creek there where we excavated areas of mercury contamination in the floodplains. Once we had the off-site risk taken care of and addressed, we then moved toward addressing what we called our large watersheds. It's like, how do we address the rest of the reservation and the contamination there? The three parties elected to address very large watersheds. We have what we call Bear Creek Valley record of decision. We have Bethel Valley record of decision, Melton Valley, Upper East Fork, and then we have our areas at ETTP, Zone 1 and Zone 2, that we decided to address as watersheds. Then once we had those signed, the first action we took, the main area of focus was to address ETTP. It was the one facility, both Ornell and Y12 have future mission. They're still active facilities. So a lot of the area there wasn't ready for cleanup. ETTP had basically the gaseous diffusion plant had shut down. And so it was primed for us to go in and conduct our cleanup. The first thing we addressed was the demolition of the buildings. Once they were down, we had access to the areas underneath the buildings. We were able to address the soils underneath there. And then the reason we did that is there was no point in going all the way to the groundwater if the source to the groundwater contamination was still there. You could continue to address groundwater contamination when the source is still active. It's sort of a futile effort. What we have gotten to now is we have addressed most of our groundwater sources in the soil. We have a couple of very large digs that we are intending to have completed by 2024. So now we are in a position to begin addressing our groundwater contamination issues. This with another record of decision that we are planning to get signed for what we call the main plant area. These two are our first steps toward addressing groundwater at the ETTP site. This shows you how the ETTP site is broken up for groundwater decisions. The area in blue or purple is what we call the K-31-33 area. It's labeled that because it was the existence of the two former gaseous diffusion buildings there, K-31 and K-33, were the main buildings in that area. There were support facilities, but for the most part, it was two very large gaseous diffusion buildings. The area to the right of that in the green is what we call the main plant groundwater area. That is an area that was the historic center of the activity at the facility, the industrial complex, so to speak. That's where the K-25 building was, K-27 and K-29 buildings. We are, like I mentioned earlier, we're preparing to enter into a record of decision or negotiate a record of decision with TDEC and EPA to address interim actions in there. We will address 6 source areas there. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the very end. And then on the sort of the outside of what we call the donut, the larger area in yellow, that's what we call Zone 1. That was historically not a very active industrial area, but there were activities that occurred there that created some small areas of groundwater contamination that we still need to address. We're currently in the remedial investigation work plan phase, working on that. That's where we're working with the regulators to decide how do we investigate the groundwater in those areas. So the scope of this particular proposed plan, the idea is, number one, is to limit, the scope is limited to that area in the purple or blue so that we have a fairly defined geographic area. Part of that area is bounded by a creek, which we feel confident that the groundwater daylights into there. So that's one boundary. And the groundwater doesn't flow to the north up a ridge. So we feel like we have bounded the area of contamination fairly well that way. There are a number of monitoring wells that have been there historically and some new ones that we've put in place, so we feel like we have a good monitoring system in place. then the overall concentrations, this will lead to the decision that we've selected, which is monitored natural attenuation, is that the levels of contamination have been gradually declining over the years. So as I'll explain the remedy in a little bit, that hopefully that'll help you understand why we got to that remedy selection. And then the last part is the most recent results, this is very encouraging, show that the concentrations in the groundwater have now dropped below what we call drinking water standards, which is the cleanup standard for groundwater. Both EPA and TDEC require us, because so many people use groundwater for drinking water sources across the country. That is your goal, is to make sure that if somebody were to use the groundwater here, that it would be viable as a drinking water source. One thing to understand is, regardless of what the remedy is, or even if a remedy is put in place, when DOE transfers property here in Oak Ridge, one of the things we always do is we put in place a deed restriction, which says whoever owns the property after that cannot use the groundwater. So there's a lot of reasons for that. One is because there may be potential contamination, but there are a variety of other reasons that we do it, just out of a sense of conservancy, so that we will not create issues. So the K-31, 33 groundwater sampling, this is a closer view of that area. You can see the big clear squares. Those are the footprints of the original buildings. There are a series of 21 wells currently located around that. At one time, there were also, as part of our work with TDEC and EPA, we put in what we call temporary, they're called piezometers, but they're very small wells in the middle of the old building footprints, because you can imagine when the buildings were active, there was no way to evaluate groundwater underneath those buildings. So we have a whole series of wells. There were 2 wells that basically located in these lower right-hand corner of this footprint that historically had levels of nickel and chromium that were slightly above the MCLs, but as I mentioned earlier, sampling results have shown a steady decline, and fortunately results that we just received last week indicate that the levels in those 2 wells have now dropped below drinking water standards by a fairly significant level. So that's a very good indication that this approach that we're selecting will continue to work. So when we do a remedy selection, we have a series, part of the steps we go through to get there is we do a remedial investigation based on the results of all of that sampling. We put together what's called a feasibility study. Sometimes it's what we call a focused feasibility study. And in that, we look at different alternatives as far as different ways of addressing levels of contamination. One alternative that we always have to evaluate, and it's because the regulations require you to do this, is what we call the no action alternative. This action is just like it says, it involves doing nothing. And it's a requirement. It's never the selected alternative, because one of the reasons you're doing the investigation and the cleanup is because you have an unacceptable risk. So you sort of know that's not going to be the one that's selected. It is a zero cost alternative, at least as far as implementation. One of the things that we don't usually include, though, is that if you don't do any action, there are other associated costs with leaving contamination in place. The second alternative for the K-31, 33 area is what we call monitored natural attenuation. This is the one that was selected as the preferred alternative. The way it works is what we've done, as I mentioned earlier, we have seen over time a steady decline in the levels of contamination in the wells at the site. There are processes and mechanisms that occur in nature, both in the groundwater and because of both natural conditions and physical conditions in the groundwater, that can cause levels of contamination to decline over time. So that was based on the results that we have, that has been the selected remedy for this. The third alternative was to actually put in place, and this is a requirement by EPA, is to evaluate active remediation methods. The third alternative was to actually go in and putting in place what we call a pump and treat, where you actually take the wells, you put pumps down there, you pull the water up, you treat it, and then you either discharge it or you re-inject it back into the well. Sometimes this is the most useful remedy, but other times it may not be. I'll explain why that was not the selected alternative for this proposed plan. And then both alternative 2 and 3 also rely on continued land use controls. When I mentioned earlier, one of the things DOE always does on all our property transfers is we have deed restrictions restricting use of groundwater. That is one of the land use controls that we have in place. One of the other items that we have to look at is when we're evaluating, there are 9 what we call decision criteria. One of those is cost. As I mentioned earlier, alternative 1 has a $0 cost for implementation because you're not doing anything. Alternative 2, which is the one we selected, that's in the proposed plan, would cost roughly $1.8 million. That involves them placing in, for cost comparisons, we estimated that we may have to put in place 8 additional wells, and then the continued monitoring of the water coming out of those wells over the next 5 years. That the cost of all that put together was about 1.8. The third alternative, which was the putting in place the pump and treat, as you can imagine, a much more robust system that requires large pumps, treatment systems, things like that, operated over a 5-year period. The estimated cost for that was a little over $11 million. So as I mentioned, that we have what we call the decision criteria under CERCLA. These are things that these are ways we have to look at each remedy that is being proposed and compare it to these criteria. And they're sort of broken up into 3 groups. The first group is what we call threshold criteria. Think of these as the first yes/no questions. You have to answer yes to these questions for you to continue the selection process for that particular remedy. The first is, as it says, overall protection of human health and the environment. So you know that you already have a situation where there's a risk, that you're out there doing this work because there's an unacceptable risk. So your end goal is you have to protect human health and the environment. So you have to answer that question yes. The next is compliance with, so long it says applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements. That just very simply means we have to obey the rules and laws and regulations. You know, there are a lot, like for instance, the one I mentioned earlier about meeting MCLs for groundwater contamination. That's one, we have to meet that. There are a lot of other rules and regulations related to cleaning up groundwater in the environment. The short term, you'll hear people talk about this, those are called ARARs, A-R-A-R. We love our acronyms. So anyway, so those are the first 2 criteria. You have to answer yes to both of those. Next, you have what you call your balancing criteria. These are not so much yes/no answers as, yeah, we get a lot of this, we get a little of this. And there are things like, for instance, what is the long-term effectiveness and permanence of the remedy? How much does it reduce toxicity, mobility of contaminants in the environment? What is the short-term effectiveness? You know, over just a few years will this work? Next is the ability to implement. There are a lot of theoretical approaches to cleaning up groundwater, but when you pull those in, and a lot of times they work great in a laboratory on a bench scale type of aspect, but when you pull those in and you try to implement those in the field where you have large scale, you quickly realize that they just don't work that well. And then last, that we've already covered, is one of the factors is cost. You know, there is a limit to the amount of money that we are able to throw at some of these issues. And then the last group is what we call the modifying criteria. This is one of the reasons we are here tonight, is to get your input from the public on what this remedy is. The other part is what we call state acceptance of the remedy. That enters into when we give the proposed plan to both EPA and TDEC. The state gives us comments back on that, and in part of the proposed plan, there is a section where the state can enter in what their comments on the proposed plan are. So that's all part of the process to get this proposed plan approved. So the preferred alternative, as I mentioned earlier, was monitored natural attenuation. As I said, this is an approved EPA method. out of the list of all the different things you can do: active remediation, monitored natural attenuation, and many of the different actions of active remediation. This is one that we have selected for this area. Part of that is because the area where we've detected contamination appears to be limited to just 2 of those 21 wells. And now, fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, our most recent sampling results even indicate in those 2 wells, the levels of contamination have dropped down below the drinking water standards. So it really makes this a good candidate for carrying forward a remedy of M&A. We still need to work through the details of that remedy with our TDEC and EPA, but that is our next step. So the components of the remedy will be, the next steps, we'll come up with what we call a remedial. After we get the record of decision signed, we will come up with what's called a remedial action work plan. This will describe how we will monitor the wells, which wells we will monitor, if we need additional wells put in place. It'll also describe what we will do if, for reasons we may not understand, if the levels of contamination begin to rise again in some of the wells. We'll be monitoring these basically. For the first 2 years, we'll be doing quarterly monitoring. So there will be a series of 8 samples taken from these wells. And then if everything seems to continue well after that, we will continue what we call semi-annual, which will be every 6 months. As we watch this, if the levels continue to decline, we will continue to monitor and keep reporting that to EPA and TDEC and to the public. If the levels begin to increase, then we will have to evaluate new alternatives. There is a process in CERCLA called the 5-year review, which means after you in place a remedy, every 5 years after that, you have to come back and evaluate whether that remedy is still being effective, if you're accomplishing what you set out to do. And then the last part is the land use controls. Once again, I'll go over this, is we put in place a deed restriction that prohibits the use of groundwater to any property that we've transferred. That will stay in place. Even if the remedy is effective and the levels of contamination stay below the drinking water standards, with that deed restriction will still stay in place, and people will be prohibited from using groundwater at that site. I know this is difficult to see, but it shows you where some of the wells are located right now around the perimeter. As I mentioned earlier, historically, we weren't able to put wells in the middle because that was in the footprint of the buildings. We will work with EPA and TDEC to determine where all the monitoring wells, whether we keep using the ones we have or if we need new ones. The cost, as I mentioned earlier, involved an estimate that we may need upwards of 8 wells. So the cost was how much would it cost to install those. One thing that's already occurred, the property itself has been transferred to private industries or to other entities, other environmental management. None of this will impact their activities. Some of you may be aware there's a company called Kairos that is looking to build a pilot test reactor out at the site that's located in this footprint. None of their work will be impacted by where we select these wells. And then, of course, the UPF project from Y12 is also located there, and we make sure that our wells don't impact their activities. So the preferred alternatives meet all of the statutory requirements. First and foremost, it is protective of human health and the environment. With the use of the land use controls in the first part of the remedy, eventually, hopefully, and it should happen, if the levels continue to drop, it will continue to be protective even without the land use controls. It is cost effective, as we demonstrated. It costs more than no action, but it's about a factor of 10 less than pump and treat. It constitutes a permanent remedy. We'll continue to monitor and watch, but as long as the levels stay below the drinking water levels, it's a permanent remedy. It reduces the contaminants because of the natural actions in the ground. It reduces the level of contamination below drinking water standards. And given that we believe that we will attain this, actually we believe we may have already attained it, but surely we think we will attain it within the next 5 years. It's within a reasonable time frame. So the remedial action objectives, every remedy has objectives. What are you trying to achieve here? It's very simple. Restore the groundwater to drinking water standards, like we've talked about. Prevent exposure or consumption to contaminated groundwater. We do this two ways: by continuing to have the levels drop below the drinking water levels and by using our land use restrictions. And then last, prevent adverse impacts to surface water where the groundwater may be migrating and discharging to surface water bodies. If the water meets drinking water standards, then we're confident that it will have no adverse effects on surface water. And that's sort of the wrap up. So if you have anything you would like to comment on as part of this project, you can either send them to me at this address listed here through regular mail. You can send an email to the address shown here. The comment period for this project started on April 25th. It runs through for 45 days through June 12th. You have until then to send us your comments. You're more than welcome to give comments here tonight. You can either ask questions. If you ask questions, those questions will be recorded, and then we will prepare answers to those questions, and those will be included in the record of decision that follows this document. If you just have a comment, we're willing to take those. They don't have to be critical. You can also say that you're in favor of this action or not for whatever reason. All of those will be captured, comments and questions, and like I said, they will be captured in the responsiveness summary of the record of decision, verbatim. We won't alter them. We won't try to interpret what you asked. It'll be written down verbatim, and an answer will be prepared to your statements. So, as I mentioned earlier, 2 weeks ago in this same room, we had a presentation on what we called the main plant groundwater. Also a record of decision that we are aiming for. It is an interim action. The final part of that remedy will not be meeting drinking water standards, but hopefully reducing the level of contamination so that other possible remedies will be more effective. That comment period is also currently underway, and if you would like, we would love to hear more comments on that from the public. Tonight, we would prefer that you just focus your comments on the K-31, 33, and then if you have comments on the other one, you can send them to me through the mail or through email, either way. So with that, we will go back. I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. So public input on the preferred alternative presented at the proposal plan will be video recorded following the presentation. So for this process, for the comment process, those wishing to provide input or make a comment during the public comment segment, we're asking you to indicate that on the sign-up sheet, which I have here. You're going to be called in order in which you signed up. We'll have 3 minutes to speak, and if you're not finished with that statement, you'll be able to complete it after everyone's had the opportunity to do so. We'll also stay to hear your comments as long as needed. Please speak clearly into the microphone and ensure that your comment is captured on the video recording, and we can accurately record your input. State and spell your name for the record. If you do not want to provide comments verbally, please feel free to provide them on the comment cards available in the back of the room or as you first walked in. And you can either email them or mail a letter to the contacts on the screen behind me, or on either side of me rather. A video recording of tonight's presentation will be posted online if you want to view it again prior to the comments, making comments. All right. So Luther Gibson.
I'm going to change the maybe to a no.
Okay, Luther. Thank you. Doug, my apologies. I don't know how to spell your last name. Okay. Would you like to make comments at this time? And please say your name and speak your name, please, or spell your name for the record.
Glacier, Dugclasure. Both this and the main plant document have a very brief paragraph. In this case, it's on page 7. The deed restricts disturbance of the soil on the property to no more than 10 feet below ground level. Are all industrial reindustrialization prospects made aware of this? And how is that going to restrict the reindustrialization of the property? It seems there are projects being considered now that would require more than 10 feet. I haven't seen the Kairos reactor or the Koki Pharma project reactor documents, but it almost seems certain that they would need footers below 10 feet. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Ellen Smith?
Ellen Smith, ELLEN SMITH, just like you would expect. I appreciate that this is a site that's industrial, it's going to be covered by a lot of paved surfaces and buildings and so forth, which does reduce the potential risk to the public and the potential for anybody to access groundwater for that matter, and makes it easier to consider monitoring natural attenuation. I am concerned, as was Mr. K-33, about the depth of excavation. It was my understanding in years past that the limited depth of excavation was an interim requirement during such time as RIFS work was being carried out at the site. It wasn't necessarily going to be a permanent restriction. I think that as a city council member, I'm concerned that the community may not get what we thought we were going to get as a cleaned up site if that limited depth of excavation becomes permanent. So I'm concerned about that. And another concern that I have is about the hexavalent chromium, which is actually the most significant contaminant identified in the document for groundwater at this site. And my impression is that most of the chromium data that has been collected in the RFS process has been total chromium. So we don't have good information on the distribution of the different species of chromium. That hexavalent chromium is the toxic one. It wasn't clear to me whether all chromium was assumed to be hexavalent for purposes of evaluating against the standards, or whether there was some notion that some of it wasn't hexavalent. So that's one concern I have about hexavalent chromium. The other is that hexavalent chromium isn't something that readily attenuates. The sense that I got in the document was that the natural attenuation we're looking for is basically slow dilution, diffusion, and advection, coupled with the likelihood of some sort of degradation or chemical reduction to other forms of chromium that don't have the same toxicity. But I didn't see any indication of analysis to identify what in the groundwater environment was going to be fostering any kind of chemical reduction to the other forms of chromium. And I think I would like to know what processes we're relying on, rather than saying we're treating the site as a black box and we're hoping that because numbers have been declining, there must be something going on that's causing the decline. I'd like to know what we're depending on to provide a reduction in toxicity. And if there is nothing in there to accelerate the reduction of chrome to other forms, I'd like to see something done to provide, whether it's humic acids or soils that could be added to the ground or something, some sort of a passive barrier to reduce the chromium. those are my concerns, and they're mostly about this well company. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Is there any other member of the public who would like to make a comment? Well, thank you for attending. We'll be here until 8 o'clock. And if you have, any other questions, that may be captured in the video recording.